The Ghost Ship of Matosinhos. Dusk enveloped Matosinhos, a coastal town near the city of Porto, in a purple and gold haze that stretched over the moored boats in the harbor. The usually placid Atlantic inlet was beginning to stir with an unusual energy. Few fishermen recognized the signs of the coming weather. Most were engrossed in unloading nets brimming with sardines, in conversations punctuated by the roar of the sea and the clamor of seagulls circling for a bite. The air smelled of brine and seaweed, and every corner of the pier seemed to pulse with the city's centuries-old heartbeat. A short distance from the quay stood the Estrela de Matosinhos, a medium-sized fishing vessel whose pinewood hull and metal reinforcements attested to decades of relentless service. The hull bore scars from past storms, and its sails, along with the small auxiliary engine mounted at the stern, revealed a blending of age-old tradition and modern convenience. The captain, a man with a sun-beaten face and skin etched by years of salt air, oversaw with a practiced gaze the loading of barrels of provisions, fishing gear, and portable refrigerators for fresh catch. The crew, composed of seasoned seafarers and young apprentices, went back and forth with ropes, nets, and trawl lines, exchanging jokes and silent camaraderie born of a shared, grueling occupation, wresting the sea's bounty from its merciless depths. That evening, however, the atmosphere was charged. The sky, still seemingly clear, felt unsettlingly calm, and the wind, which usually blew with the day's final vigor, drifted in abrupt gusts. With the tide rising and the horizon shifting from rosy to a murky violet, the captain of the Estrela de Matosinhos wavered between setting sail for a nighttime catch or postponing the trip. Reason suggested caution, but an urge, along with the necessity of making a living, drove him to press on. Deep down, he sensed a storm brewing, yet his resolve and routine overcame any looming dread. As the sun slipped behind the mountains and darkness settled over the coast, the Estrela de Matosinhos cast off. Lanterns illuminated the coiled nets on deck and the silhouettes of the crew members bracing themselves against the rising sea, which was becoming ominously restless. The men divided tasks. Some fastened ropes, others monitored the auxiliary engine. The captain, faintly uneasy, watched his compass and the small suite of navigation instruments he had outfitted on the helm, a symbol of the delicate balancing act between ancient ways and modern technology. About 2 miles offshore, clouds began amassing with startling speed. A foreboding darkness spread from the west, occasionally lit by distant lightning flickers. The wind picked up unexpectedly, thrashing the sails. The crew, on alert, rushed to furl part of the rigging to avoid disaster. Suddenly, a deafening thunderclap tore across the sky. Heavy drops of rain started pelting down, and a brutal downpour seized them. Illuminated by lightning, the sea transformed into a maelstrom of towering waves that rose like foam-fanged monsters. The sails that remained unfurled ripped, letting out a howl, and the boat was forced to rely on its motor to resist the frantic current. The storm, flickering with electricity that cut the darkness, offered a spectacle of nature's fury, mesmerizing and terrifying in equal measure. The Estrela de Matosinhos groaned and lurched with each surge, and the men, tethered to safety lines, struggled not to be swept overboard. At the height of this frenzy, a monstrous bolt of lightning seemed to strike somewhere close to the ship. The place of impact glowed with a bluish gleam, reminiscent of a spectral flame dancing on the ocean's surface, and the water swirled in an unnatural vortex that contorted space itself. A rumble, deep as the Earth's core, resonated across the storm, and the sky momentarily blinked into total darkness. The captain felt a jarring vacuum in his chest, akin to a diver losing all sense of direction in a submerged cavern. Whatever cries the men uttered were drowned by the storm's relentless roar, and in one timeless instant, reality itself felt unstitched. After a minute, or perhaps an eternity, impossible to gauge, the waves continued slamming against the hull, but the storm's savage wind and lightning gradually receded into a subdued ferocity. The Estrella de Matosinhos, battered yet afloat, chugged along under a motor that sputtered precariously, with a few shredded sails flapping like wounded flags. The fishermen, soaked and pale, gazed around in shock, exhaling relief that they were, somehow, still alive. The question of how they'd escaped such cataclysm hovered unspoken in the air. Their astonishment grew when a crew member perched at the foremast cried out in terror and disbelief, pointing toward the horizon where a phantom ship was emerging from the fog. It was a whaler, huge and archaic, rigged with sails blackened by weather and armed with wooden gear reminiscent of an era centuries past. It looked like it had sailed straight from the times of fabled hunts, its hull painted in dark hues that suggested monstrous chases on the open sea. The captain, eyes wide, recalled stories of Moby Dick, Herman Melville's novel, and a chilling realization washed over him. Could the storm have hurled them back to that whaling age? Their presence felt like a dimension slip, mixing dread and awe in equal measure. Night stretched on, with no sign of modern ports or satellites on the horizon. The men realized that nothing about these waters resembled the Atlantic off the Portuguese coast. Their modern instruments were dead or confused. The communications array had been fried by the tempest, leaving them reliant on a battered compass and minimal diesel for the straining auxiliary engine. They could see no solution but to drift on, hoping to find a clue or an improbable rescue. At dawn, they saw the great white shape just beyond the waves, a colossal whale gliding below the surface, spouting vapor with a ghostly roar. Panic gripped them. Countless childhood stories of leviathans or the dreaded white whale hammered at their minds. Could it be Moby Dick incarnate, intangible in a half-literary, half-real domain? That same morning, they again glimpsed the archaic whaling vessel, similarly damaged. Their vantage revealed a crew arming harpoons, presumably to hunt the creature. But how to respond? The fishermen had no illusions about forging alliances with unknown men. Were these whalers as unhinged as a Captain Ahab, consumed by mania? The next hours tested their courage and redefined their sense of reality. The monstrous white whale roamed the region, occasionally breaching with savage fury. Every time the Estrella de Matosinhos tried to steer away, the beast's presence or the persistent stormy weather hindered them. The men realized that returning to their own time, if they were truly in another era, meant confronting this monster. The possibility that the whale served as a guardian of this timeline, or that slaying it could unravel the warp in reality, became the impetus for a desperate plan. They set about modifying their battered fishing boat into a makeshift warship. Using knowledge gleaned from marine engineering references stored on tablets, although no satellites or signals reached them, they repurposed parts of the hull, welded metal plates to the prow, and crafted harpoons from scraps of steel. They even rigged a crude catapult using cables and tension rods from the fishing gear. This improbable combination of old-school craftsmanship and modern adaptation gave birth to a bizarre hybrid, a humble fishing vessel turned savage fortress, intended to defend them against the largest and most storied behemoth in maritime lore. As dread and fascination churned inside them, they prepared for battle. Tension soared with every wave, each swirl of the ocean a reminder of the looming confrontation. At twilight, the giant white back surfaced, glistening unnaturally in the gloom. The first strike from the whale jarred the deck, nearly overturning the boat. Shouts melded with the roaring sea. The men launched harpoons that lodged in the beast's flank, causing a guttural, subaquatic cry that hammered their souls. In a swirl of spume, the colossus disappeared beneath the surface, only to re-emerge moments later, smashing the rig with its tail and flinging men dangerously near the water. In the midst of swirling chaos, a jerry-rigged catapult flung a final harpoon rigged with a salvaged explosive from distress flares. The impact detonated underwater in a muted flash, further enraging the monster. For minutes, the whale battered the Estrella de Matosinhos, whose patched hull threatened to fracture at any second. In a final, bloodied spasm, the creature attempted to heave itself onto the ship, but, overwhelmed by the injuries inflicted, slumped into the ocean's swirl, unmoving. The men froze, panting, hearts pounding with the adrenaline and horror of having fought a living legend. That evening, they gazed upon the inert mass of the whale floating in the near distance. Awe and remorse clashed in their chests. It was victory, but a bitter one, for this was no ordinary monster. It was a colossus that transcended fiction, believed by some to be a cosmic judge or a freakish boundary in time. The battered Estrella de Matosinhos floated precariously, its motor stuttering. The men spoke little, preferring the hush that comes after the storm. Each wondered if the whale's death would allow them to slip back to their rightful present. When dawn broke, the sea smoothed to a gray expanse. The captain realized with shock that he recognized silhouettes of the Portuguese coastline, including the faint spires of Porto in the far-off haze. Overcome by relief, they navigated carefully, finding once again that their instruments began sputtering back to partial life, as if the normal flow of history had resumed. Slowly, they approached the port. People on the docks stared agape at the mangled vessel with metal plates, tattered sails, and a battered crew. No one, nor the men themselves, could fully explain the nature of their disappearance or the state of the boat. Some guessed they'd survived a freak tempest. Others guessed at an encounter with pirates or sea monsters. But only the fishermen knew the truth they kept locked in their hearts. They had slipped into another time, back to the era of Moby Dick, faced down the monstrous white whale, and escaped by the fragile margin of existence. In the days that followed, the fishermen mended the boat. Friends and neighbors noticed how every beam, every nail hammered in, carried the silent tension of an inexplicable odyssey. Mysterious rumors circulated. They say the Estrella fought a supernatural storm. They saw ghosts on the ocean. They faced a giant white whale. The men of the Estrella de Matosinhos said almost nothing, swallowing their account in a vow of tacit secrecy, mindful that the world would mock them for even hinting that they'd physically encountered Moby Dick. At night, each of them wrestled with nightmares of a raging ocean strewn with illusions of phantom ships and monstrous creatures, of an infinite swirl where the past and present merged in dread. Yet they also harbored a sense of bitter pride. They'd survived the unimaginable, had defied the laws of time, and confronted a living myth. The romance between modern knowledge and a savage historical epic etched itself in their souls as a primal memory, a testament to the idea that one can never truly conquer the sea or the intangible might of the unknown. When they set sail again, some semblance of normalcy returned, but the quiet, reverent hush that fell whenever a squall threatened revealed the changes in them. A watchful reflex replaced their old bravado. They prayed to the restless Atlantic not to open again the portals of time, not to subject them to another impossible journey. Yet a corner of each man's mind relived the terror and wonder of that confrontation with the white whale, a testament to how history and legend sometimes bleed across the boundaries of existence. Somewhere in the city's taverns, over mugs of wine and the haze of tobacco, the men occasionally alluded to a storm that transported them beyond reason. Eager ears seeking ghost stories listened in rapt silence, gleaning that they'd glimpsed the monstrous shape of a whale from archaic lore. The fishermen would merely tighten their jaws, offering no further explanation. And in the hush before dawn, on certain nights, a distant moaning whistle might echo from the sea, suggesting that time itself still carried the faint echo of that monstrous beast, the ghost of Moby Dick prowling the edges of reason, reminding mortals of the fragility of the temporal fabric they inhabit. In the days after their return, the Estrella de Matosinhos gradually regained its seagoing form. Planks replaced, battered metal plates discreetly removed to avoid questions from maritime inspectors, and mechanical parts refitted so the vessel could once again venture out to catch fish for local markets. The men resumed the daily rhythm of casting nets at dawn, hauling them in at midday, and returning home with the routine bustle of sellers and townsfolk. But an invisible boundary separated them from the rest. An aura of solemn respect coated their interactions, as though they bore an ancient secret. For their part, the men realized that intangible consequences of their temporal misadventure persisted in subtle ways. Some occasionally glimpsed flickers, like fleeting illusions in the periphery of their vision, of old whaling ships or swirling storms on calm waters. Others dreamt of monstrous shapes approaching from the deep, accompanied by the thrumming organ note of a whale's heartbeat. The fear that the timeline might not be fully restored, that cracks might remain for other anomalies to slip through, haunted them. This suspicion colored their relationships, turning them quiet in the face of trivial jokes from neighbors or passers-by who teased them about the battered old boat. The captain, in lonely moments on deck at sunset, often touched the battered compass that had spun wildly the night of the storm. He mused that the swirl of that unstoppable force was not purely meteorological but cosmic, as though the ocean had recognized their boat as a vector for bridging centuries. Even more disconcerting was the guilt that tormented him. For all their cunning and nerve, they'd killed a creature that perhaps symbolized the raw might of the unknown. Did that act of violence seal their escape, or had they committed an atrocity that might yet ripple through time? Beyond Matosinhos, the world remained unaware of their real adventure. The official records listed them as victims of a freak tempest, missing for some hours or half a day, then returning with minimal explanation. Conspiracy whispers sprouted in online corners. Some hypothesized that the Estrella de Matosinhos had encountered a gateway to the Bermuda Triangle's cosmic rift, or that top-secret technology had warped the local environment. The fishermen, ill at ease with such rumors, neither confirmed nor denied anything. They soldiered on with daily life, mending nets, maintaining the boat, and occasionally feeling the weight of a silent question. What if, next time, we cannot return? The local ecclesiastical authorities and village elders became suspicious. Certain old priests, versed in superstitions of the sea, perceived subtle changes in the men's eyes, the vacant stare of individuals who've witnessed a reality at odds with the church's worldview. Some approached them with caution, inquiring about nightmares or apparitions. The fishermen responded with half-truths or muteness, protecting the deeper truths of their ordeal, considering them sacred, beyond the realm of easy conversation or remedy. One quiet afternoon, while moored in the harbor, the captain found a piece of flotsam near the boat's hull, a chunk of timber etched with archaic carvings, seemingly from the whaler they'd encountered. Gripping it, he sensed an echo of its era, as though the plank carried the memory of hunts on savage seas. He showed it to a couple of the crew, who recognized the style reminiscent of 19th-century whaling vessels. The reality that evidence of their journey might lurk in the ocean, drifting, left them uneasy. The timeline was fragile, and lumps of that anachronistic reality might appear on present-day beaches, unmasking their secret or, worse, summoning further cosmic disruptions. Haunted by the possible repercussions, the captain wrestled with an irrational longing. Part of him craved another crossing of that temporal threshold to glean clarity. After all, they'd endured a collision with the ephemeral dimension of Moby Dick and survived. Might there be deeper knowledge or purpose in bridging eras? Yet each man who had glimpsed the whale's monstrous eye recalled the primal fear of standing before the unstoppable, They recognized that any attempt to reopen that vortex might court an even graver cataclysm. The mixture of lure and terror weighed heavily, creating a stifling tension in their camaraderie. Some nights, they found themselves in the local tavern, sipping green wine in tacit communion. They'd exchange glances loaded with meaning. One might mention the calmness of the sea, and another would recall the improbable swirl that devoured them that fateful day. Memory and silence formed a pact. The sense of comedic relief that used to color fishermen's stories about monstrous fish or record-breaking storms had vanished. Now their accounts felt like testimonies from war veterans, barbed with ghosts and the relentless question: if the sea's whim brought them back once, might it claim them again? One final twist emerged when a marine biology research vessel from Porto arrived in Matosinhos. Its crew was investigating sightings of unknown marine mammals or anomalies on the ocean floor. They had data indicating a severe electromagnetic disturbance in a zone off the coast around the time of the Estrella de Matosinhos disappearance. The scientists discreetly asked the fishermen for clues, suspecting that they'd encountered something extraordinary. But the men offered only half smiles and vague remarks about storms, never hinting that they'd physically experienced a shift in centuries or confronted a whale from out of Melville's pages. Still, the curiosity of the scientists sparked fear among the crew. They worried that advanced probes or submersibles might one day discover the remains of a massive white whale in an era to which it didn't belong, or perhaps detect subtle rifts in space-time that lingered near the ocean floor. If that happened, the story might come to light, and the fate of the Estrella de Matosinhos might be dissected by experts in quantum physics and maritime lore, unleashing controversies that would disrupt their quiet existences. Yet time flows on, as unstoppable as the tide. The men learned to bury their memories beneath the routine of fishing, the daily auctions in the market, and the comforting hush of everyday conversation about the weather or the quality of the catch. The boat, patched and reacquainted with the Atlantic's gentle face, resumed normal journeys. Only in the hush of certain dawns, when the sea glowed faintly with phosphorescent algae, did the fishermen glimpse a fleeting silhouette of a monstrous tail or sense an unearthly hush, reminiscent of the dimension they'd once breached. In those moments, goosebumps pricked their arms, and an unspoken vow bound them. They would never again tempt the swirling eddies of time. Nevertheless, the lessons and terrors from that interlude resonated in their hearts. The intangible border between their life's normalcy and a realm of cosmic unpredictability had thinned. The memory of having reversed to the age of Moby Dick, battling a legendary white whale, tinted their perception of the sea. They revered it now not just as a livelihood, but as a gateway to the unknown. Perhaps in a future squall, a glitch in reality would reactivate the vortex, and another chapter of their story would begin. Or perhaps the Leviathan's demise had closed that door forever, sealing their fate in a present that never quite felt the same. At times, when solitary on the harbor's edge, the captain would place a trembling hand on the boat's timbers. He would feel the rhythms of memory flicker, recalling the single fleeting day or night when the sea's wrath tore a hole in the centuries and laid them bare before the spirit of Moby Dick. The aftertaste left him with an odd gratitude, a sense that the monstrous side of existence can impart humility. But it also left a lingering sorrow, a knowledge that the world is more mutable than we wish to believe, and that a single night can dash the lines that anchor men to their era. Hence, life in Matosinhos moved forward. The Estrella de Matosinhos sailed out at dawn, returned at dusk with nets of shining fish. The everyday music of the market, the gulls overhead, and the chatter of passers-by gave the impression that all was normal. Only the quiet watchers might notice, in the eyes of the returning fishermen, a shadowed distance hinting at the silhouette of a giant white whale that once roamed a sea from another time. The fishermen had crossed paths with an impossible legend, wrested themselves from the grip of a cosmic anomaly, and come back. No words nor accolades could fully capture that union of terror, heroism, and devotion to survival. And so it was that the story of the Estrella de Matosinhos was whispered in half-truths, retold in subdued voices under tavern lamps or around the hush of the harbor, weaving a tapestry of ghostly storms and improbable haunts. The more time passed, the more it receded into rumor and fable. Perhaps, as the years wore on, the men died with their secret intact, leaving only the bones of a battered boat in a salvage yard and legends of a monstrous whale, half myth and half time warp. Yet in that momentous hush, the sea, with its endless horizon, continued to breathe mysteries, reminding humankind that we sail upon a thin membrane of normalcy, always overshadowed by the hidden forces roiling beneath, ready to toss us across centuries at the flick of a cosmic storm. The anachronistic suburb of Kansas. The late afternoon sunlight bathed a quiet street near Kansas City in a haze of orange and rose, illuminating rows of neatly kept lawns, mailboxes standing by the curb, and the occasional barking of a neighbor's dog. In this serene suburban environment, each house exuded a sense of standard modern comfort, with minivans and SUVs parked in driveways, children's bicycles scattered on sidewalks, and the hum of lawnmowers in the distance. Amid that atmosphere of quotidian calm, Hannah and Marcus, a young married couple, were renovating a Victorian home that had drawn them in at first sight. Tall and narrow, with an ornate turret and stained glass windows, it seemed an outlier in a neighborhood of boxy ranch-style houses and modern two-story homes. The building exuded history, a sense of having witnessed many lifetimes, and they felt compelled to restore its dusty corners and hidden passages. They spent weeks tearing down rotted plaster, revealing lathe, sorting through old furniture left behind. The musty smell of aged wallpaper and decaying wood clung to their clothes. Beneath the basement floor, a loose panel caught their attention one evening, as they pried it up to examine the foundations. Their flashlight beams revealed an unseen compartment, a cramped crawl space lined with moldering crates, sealed ammo boxes, and corroded bayonet tips poking out of tattered burlap sacks. The flickering beam cast shadows on a battered uniform, Union blue, though discolored by time, and a chest with the faint stenciled letters KS Militia. With hearts pounding, they pried open the chest's lid and discovered relics of the American Civil War, canteens etched with regimental insignia, a battered journal, and a set of tarnished medals for bravery. The realization that their modern suburban home rested on hidden war relics both thrilled and unsettled them, igniting the sense that centuries of untold stories converged beneath their new floorboards. Darkness fell, leaving them awash in speculation. The discovery felt monumental, a direct link to the region's violent past. The Civil War had raged fiercely through Kansas, entangling the border with Missouri in raids and guerrilla warfare that overshadowed ordinary life. Yet the decades had buried most of those events under shopping malls, highways, and identical suburban lawns. Hannah and Marcus mused about the significance of these relics. Were they hidden for safety or for more sinister reasons? But exhaustion from the day's renovation overcame them, and they retreated to bed, unaware that they had unleashed forces neither modern science nor historical record could explain. That night, a soft wind rattled the newly installed windows, and a hush of uneasy tension pervaded the house. Hannah stirred from sleep, the hair on her neck standing on end as she caught a faint sound, low and resonant, like a whinnying horse. The noise recurred, coupled with the distant crack of musket fire. A sudden heaviness invaded her chest, and for a moment, it seemed as if the bedroom walls wavered, overshadowed by the silhouette of some ephemeral barn or outbuilding. Marcus, half awake, glimpsed a flash of muzzle fire dancing across the wall. Then the moment faded, leaving them in trembling confusion. Had it been a dream or a trick of the imagination? They convinced themselves it was the stress of renovations and drifted into uneasy slumber. Yet the next morning, stepping onto the porch for coffee, they were confronted with an uncanny sight. The street, though still lined with modern cars and mailboxes, hosted a small wagon perched on wooden wheels not far from the curb, as though it had materialized from a reenactment or a festival. The driver was absent. A sense of disorientation swept through them. Neighbors emerged onto their front yards in states of perplexity, pointing at anomalies, a battered sign for a general store set up on a corner, or footprints that might have been left by horses. All of it was incongruous with suburban routine. The whir of a passing minivan clashed with the sight of an elderly man from across the street, who discovered men in worn Confederate jackets trudging behind his backyard fence, fading in and out like ghosts. Alarm spread as people tried to rationalize the sightings. Was a historical filming taking place? Some playful stunt? Hannah and Marcus recognized these signals as manifestations connected to the Civil War relics. Pushing back fear, they roamed the block, searching for more clues. Toward the street's end, the landscape flickered, unveiling farmland dotted with archaic wagons, then snapping back to modern form as though reality stuttered. The hush, thick as a thundercloud, roiled in the air, broken by the intermittent echo of gunshots or the thunder of cavalry hooves echoing from nowhere. That evening, the neighborhood convened in hushed assembly. Teachers, doctors, software developers, and retirees gathered in a cul-de-sac to exchange experiences. Some described how stepping off their driveway led them onto dirt roads for an instant, glimpsing uniformed shapes or hearing bugle calls. Others found themselves blocked by ephemeral fences that flickered into existence, as if time's fabric was coming undone around them. Everyone's phone signals remained intact, the internet normal, yet the environment itself was warping. Tensions and a sense of impending crisis soared. Hannah, increasingly agitated, realized she was at the epicenter of the phenomenon. Something in the basement's secret stash had triggered a silent chain reaction. She recalled the battered journal scrawled with archaic script. She and Marcus reread passages referencing an unholy crossing of lines, and the day the halls of time parted near the Kansas border. They learned of fleeting references to a ritual of syzygy, a cryptic ceremony that certain Civil War soldiers had performed to summon ephemeral illusions to outmaneuver their enemies. Perhaps the residual energy from that ritual had latched onto the suburban sprawl, merging the modern neighborhood with Civil War-era guerrilla conflict. As the sun dropped behind the suburban horizon, a subtle mist enveloped the streets. The interior lights flickered, as though the electricity fought an unseen force. People peered through windows at the shapes trotting along the sidewalks. Union scouts, half translucent, scanning the area as though reconnoitering a battlefield, and Confederate riders following behind. This warlike presence, revived from the 1860s, caused fear to suffuse every household. The subdued glow of laptops and smart TVs formed a jarring contrast with the phantasmal flicker of lanterns from the ephemeral soldiers. No one openly stepped outside, uncertain whether crossing the threshold might strand them in an earlier epoch. Nonetheless, Hannah, compelled by a mixture of guilt and responsibility, braved the porch once more. She suspected the Civil War relics in her basement were central to controlling or sealing the vortex. Tremors of dread coursed through her as she recalled the ephemeral barn-like silhouette that had replaced her bedroom walls momentarily. If these illusions strengthened, the entire suburb might slip fully into the mid-19th century, dooming them to a violent frontier era. She realized that reversing the effect might require bridging advanced technology with archaic ritual. This prospect terrified her, but there was no alternative. Marcus, similarly anxious, rummaged for his modern gadgets, a small 3D printer, custom microprocessors, salvage electronics from their renovation, hoping that reappropriating these devices might produce a containment field. They hammered out a plan: replicate components that could channel or invert the energetic residue from the basement relics, while also employing centuries-old protective charms gleaned from the battered diaries. It was a fusion of cutting-edge science and historical arcana that made reason quiver. Even as they prepared, the lines dividing centuries grew blurrier. The neighbors texted group updates in real time, describing seeing trench lines forming near the elementary school or hearing cannon blasts near the supermarket. The phenomenon accelerated, layering horse-drawn wagons among parked sedans, conjuring ghostly watchers in ragged uniforms lurking behind suburban hedges. The ambience turned claustrophobic, reminiscent of a psychological horror film, as if each lawn and facade was overshadowed by a battlefield specter. In an eerie twist, many neighbors succumbed to the illusions, wandering blocks that had become labyrinths of historical urban overlap. A few vanished entirely, their last messages describing stepping onto unpaved roads that led nowhere. Rumors of a lost detachment of Confederate raiders kidnapping unsuspecting homeowners circulated, stoking primal terror. Hannah shuddered, aware that the next victim could be any of them. One midnight, Marcus tinkered with the microprocessors in a frantic attempt to craft an oscillator capable of neutralizing the time rift's energy. Meanwhile, Hannah, leafing through the soldier's diary, identified references to an Union-Confederate alliance that once invoked a clandestine rite near the very grounds of their home. The text recounted the formation of a protective circle drawn with chalk and iron, as well as the chanting of half-Latin incantations that invoked the land's ancestral power. Yet the author wrote that they'd never succeeded. The illusions emerged uncontrollably each time the circle was performed incorrectly. As if to confirm the diary's authenticity, the next morning's view from the couple's bedroom revealed the immediate surroundings had shifted. Telephone poles were bent or non-existent, some replaced by wooden telegraph lines. The sky bore a hazy cast, and faint plumes of black powder rose from distant musket skirmishes. Suburban houses in the mid-range had half melted into log cabins. The environment was congealing into a patchwork of modern and Civil War scenes. The dread that they were living in the final hours before a total meltdown settled deep in Hannah's gut. Marcus and Hannah deployed their plan. Descending into the basement where the relics lay, they arranged a circle of sensors, cables, and archaic objects. Union canteens, rusted rifles, tattered flags, forming a perimeter laced with microsensors programmed to emit an oscillatory pulse. Above each relic, they placed magnetically tuned rods designed to broadcast interference signals. The plan aimed to invert the synergy between the old ritual energies and the swirling vortex overhead. As they meticulously positioned each piece, the house groaned, as though timbers and drywall rebelled against the shifting timeline. As dusk approached, storms gathered overhead in ominous clouds, reminiscent of an oncoming front of musket smoke. Intense, swirling gusts battered the entire suburb, now fully enveloped in the half-lost conflict of the Civil War. The roads were strewn with ephemeral pickets, some intangible, some dangerously tangible. Neighbors cowered indoors, hearing the thunder of cannons from the edge of the development. Streetlights flickered out, replaced by lanterns that materialized sporadically. The air was electric with possibility, and fear clung to every breath. At the stroke of midnight, with the swirling energies at their peak, Marcus and Hannah activated their improvised contraption. A hum rose from the sensors, building to a resonant chord that no human ear should have heard. The relics, resonating in a synergy of old and new, began to glow with unearthly light. The basement walls, momentarily replaced by the image of a war-ravaged field, seethed with half-formed images of soldiers, some in tattered Confederate gray, others in battered Union blue. The device whined on, growing in pitch, and the ephemeral forms convulsed, as if pinned by a cosmic hand. Outside, the entire suburb roiled in chaos. Accounts from those who ventured out described a swirling red haze, where minivans shared the streets with horse-drawn artillery, school crossing signs replaced by older wooden markers, and grocery stores partially turned into bullet-riddled general stores. Overhead, time itself seemed to tear in fractal shapes across the sky. In that unspeakable madness, a new terror emerged. A furious Confederate soldier, intangible yet partially real, marched up the couple's porch, brandishing an antique revolver. Simultaneously, a Union cavalry unit galloped by, flickering as though each horse might vanish at any moment. Gunshots rang out, echoing in multiple timbers, as the illusions collided with the present. Hannah, from her vantage in the basement, saw shapes drifting through the walls above, but remained fixated on the final portion of the diaries. A line suggested that only a heartfelt, shared sacrifice between the sides can close the breach. She gleaned that the Union diaries had once predicted forging a pact with an unexpected ally, perhaps a Confederate defector or a vengeful spirit, by appealing to the human cost of war. However, in her modern scenario, she realized that logic demanded forging a metaphorical union between the warring illusions. The advanced micro-devices might saturate the environment with electromagnetic pulses, but perhaps a more personal, more emotional gesture was needed to quell the anguish fueling the ghostly armies. Without warning, a figure from the swirling illusions stepped forward into the basement as though crossing a watery membrane. A rebel soldier, dusty with travel, faintly transparent, locked eyes with Hannah. He was battered, haunted by atrocities endured. She recognized a face not of pure malice, but of desperation, someone who no longer recognized friend from foe in the chaos. In that silent moment, she extended a trembling hand. A wave of raw sorrow and longing overcame them both, bridging centuries. For a heartbeat, the soldier solidified, tears forming in his eyes, as if feeling the compassion bridging their times. Then a bright flicker from the device broke the moment, sending him reeling. The illusions retracted like a tide, battered by the synergy of frequencies. The Civil War sounds faltered, and an abating hush weighed on the basement air. Upstairs, Marcus adjusted the final settings of the device. The hum reached a crescendo. The swirling illusions outside fizzled. Neighbors described a thunderclap, and the roving soldiers scattered like shadows. The abrupt shift left the modern roads quiet, dotted with modern vehicles once more. The ephemeral horse lines melted, the smell of black powder replaced by the typical suburban aroma of lawn fertilizer and exhaust. Street by street, the block fell back into standard 21st century order. The vortex or rift overhead vanished into an unassuming, starlit sky. When the final wave of energy receded, all that remained were the battered relics in the basement and the scorch marks from the device's discharge. The diaries, now half-ash, no longer displayed the full text of that archaic ritual. Hannah and Marcus emerged from their house to find the neighbors stepping onto lawns with shared wonder. The ephemeral soldiers, the roars, and the muzzle flashes had vanished, leaving behind a mixture of awe and raw relief. In the days that followed, the community felt an unspoken bond forged by terror and synergy. No official statement could explain the events. Local news tried attributing it to mass hysteria or illusions from a freak weather phenomenon. The baffled silence of the residents overshadowed trivial clarifications. Meanwhile, Hannah found herself haunted by half-remembered glimpses of that Confederate soldier's eyes, his despairing face suspended in time. She had glimpsed something deeply human behind the illusions of war. Some nights, the couple rummaged through the basement, cleaning up the remnants of the old diaries and broken gear. They felt guilt, relief, and a pang of longing. The romance Hannah had sensed blossoming in that fleeting moment with the intangible soldier was more an empathic bond than a typical love story, but it lingered in her thoughts. An intangible question: had she, with a single gesture, brought comfort to a restless spirit, or had she lost the chance to free a soul from eternal conflict? The emotional swirl was the hidden cost of bridging centuries. As time passed, neighbors resumed suburban routines, mowing lawns, hosting barbecues, and exchanging gossip about property taxes. But a hush fell whenever someone recounted the battered wagons glimpsed or the muzzle fire echoing after dark. The memory of that ephemeral war, manifesting on modern streets, never fully died. Others insisted they sometimes heard faint musket shots late at night, carried on the breeze. A spark of paranoia remained, reminding them that the boundaries separating their era from the chaos of the Civil War might be tenuously sealed, not permanently erased. Hannah and Marcus completed renovations on their Victorian home. They installed modern fixtures, new insulation, and bright paint. Still, behind the pleasant facade, the basement remained a zone of hidden significance, a repository of diaries, microcircuit shards, and battered canteens that testified to the extraordinary. The memory of that storm of illusions, the sense of standing on the edge of 2 centuries, shaped their perspective on marriage, on community, on the fragility of time. They lived each day with deeper gratitude, but also with the abiding knowledge that the swirling echoes of the past might arise if the old diary's energy and modern technology realigned. In quiet reflection, Hannah sometimes pictured that intangible soldier, the would-be outlaw who haunted her heart. She imagined a world where they might have conversed, bridging the gulf of 160 years, forging a romance from a war's sorrow. The heartbreak and the wonder left her introspective, convinced that the rifts in time are not mere flukes, but windows into the yearning for empathy across epochs. In the hush of the night, as the new insulation dampened outside noises, she felt traces of that presence brush her mind, as if the soldier's spirit lingered to ensure they never forgot the cost of conflict and the dream that such tragedies might be undone. Eventually, the suburb, so typical in its architecture, found that its veneer of uniform calm masked a shared secret. Some families moved away, unsettled by lingering nightmares. Others stayed, drawn by an inexplicable sense of pride at having survived a cosmic swirl that forced them to face long-buried ghosts. Hannah and Marcus recognized that history, once awakened, never fully returns to slumber. The diaries in the basement might remain half-burned, but new lines of text, messages scrawled in a ghostly script, sometimes replaced the charred edges. They never dared read them thoroughly, unwilling to provoke another incursion from that violent era. They settled for coexisting with the knowledge that the past can manifest if the present trifles with forces it cannot control. And so the story of the anachronistic Kansas suburb lingered in hushed rumors. Real estate listings discreetly omitted any mention of mysterious occurrences. Occasional ephemeral sightings continued. But for those who lived through the phenomenon, the memory was woven with equal parts horror and a strange, poignant longing. A longing for a time that was not theirs, for a romance and a fellowship that transcended centuries, overshadowed by war but awakened by empathy. In the end, the swirl of illusions retreated to the corners of local folklore, leaving behind the silent testimony of a couple who had redefined the boundaries between then and now, forging new meaning from relics of the Civil War and the instruments of modern science.